We're really looking to have that participation in science contribute not only to advancing the research by bringing more observers and gathering data that professional scientists would not be able to gather on their own, but also giving them an outstanding learning opportunity, often a transformational experience by being engaged in the science. And that work is really important. It's really important right now. Most of you are old enough to have seen changes in our environment and to have seen that we have a different climate now, a different storm regime now than we would have had 40, 50, or 100 years ago. Those changes are accelerating. But a couple of examples, the growing season in this part of Maine is about 60 days longer than it was 100 years ago. It doesn't feel all that long now sometimes if you're trying to grow a tomato near the coast. But imagine how different that is, 60 days longer. And these changes can be hard to see if you enjoy the postcard view of our national parks. But if you get engaged with the research to understand how things are changing, it's much more dynamic. It poses real risks to the natural resources that we care about here in the parks, and it poses real risks to our way of life. A simple example would be the lobster fishery. Probably most people that love Maine have some connection to the lobster fishery. They either love the lobster or they're aware how important it is to our coastal economy. It's going great right now. But it's entirely possible that a combination of warming water and ocean acidification will threaten the lobster fishery in this part of Maine, and soon. We've already seen lobster fishery collapse to our west and south, so that there is no longer a vibrant lobster fishery in places like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Long Island Sound, but there once was. The lobster fishery is now concentrated here and east and north of here. So those are just a couple of examples. Our programs range really widely. We bring about 800 middle school students through here every fall in partnership with the park. They come as a 5th grade class, as a 6th grade class, from lots of schools here in Hancock County, but also from far northern Maine, far western Maine, and even other parts of the Northeast. Have a 3-day experience in the park, out of their classrooms, out of their seats, learning in ways that are pretty powerful. We have right now on campus a group of teenagers from Los Angeles who are studying ocean acidification in the intertidal with a researcher for the next week. And we'll have 9 teams like that throughout the course of the summer and fall. Many will be adults, some others will be groups of teenagers. And there are opportunities for people to participate in bird eco-tours, learn how gathering bird observation data can contribute to science, or to drop in and participate in a hawk watch on Cadillac Mountain, a sea watch at the tip of Schoodic Point, watching birds migrate in the fall, learning about the timing of their movements, changes in their populations. And so an obvious question in this story I'm telling is, where does art fit in? I talked about ecosystem science, and I talked about learning for all ages. It clearly fits in learning for all ages. But it also connects to the science, and it connects to the rich and long history of our national parks. Artists were vitally important in inspiring the creation of our national parks, here at Acadia, and also in the West and in other places. And we find art to be powerful still in helping to connect people to nature, give them a greater appreciation for the natural world, perhaps greater curiosity that leads to their interest in science and the research that's being done. And sometimes we're able to, by hosting art workshops, artist retreats, make those connections deliberately and pair the artists with the researchers so that they have an opportunity to learn from the scientists what they're working on, and the scientists have an opportunity to perhaps see their research area differently with the benefit of the artist's view and the artist's experience. So that's a pretty brief introduction to Schoodic Institute. If you are new to us, I'd certainly welcome and encourage you to stay connected. I mentioned the opportunity to come back, bring guests to see this exhibit. Pick one of these up on your way out. It's a little introduction to who we are and what we do. Has our contact information on it. And visit our website at schoodicinstitute.org. Subscribe to our email newsletter. We'd love to see you all here again. We're a young nonprofit and growing. And I did hear a bunch of questions outside, so I should give a little bit of the story. This was a Navy facility. And the Navy left here about 12 years ago because technology changed, and it was essentially no longer necessary to be at the edge of the North Atlantic in order to spy on the North Atlantic. And as a result of that, there was a big economic blow to the local communities, but this land reverted to Acadia National Park because it had been a part of Acadia National Park before the Navy was ever here. And the Park Service had come up with a concept of research learning centers because they had recognized that they have an obligation to understand the natural resources that they are trying to steward for future generations, and that their own agency didn't have the capacity to do it on their own, and partnerships were the solution. So that's what spurred the creation of Schoodic Institute. The campus has been dramatically transformed. I encourage you to explore it. You saw a great sculpture just outside of this auditorium. You probably saw the historic Rockefeller Hall building on your way up. There's a welcome center there, exhibits that you're welcome to explore. And what you don't see are the 4.5 acres of asphalt that were removed and the 16 buildings that were removed, including the largest buildings on this campus. So it really is a very different place, the walking campus that we have now, than the Navy facility that was here before. So with that, we want to let Duncan Martin tell his story about exploring 59 national parks and capturing the beautiful images that you had a chance to see out in our lobby. So please join me in welcoming Duncan Martin.
Thank you. That was a great introduction to Schoodic, which many of us probably have not ever been to. I appreciate how far some of you have traveled to be here today. I'm grateful for that. But first I want to thank Mark and his crew, Megan and her group, who have provided the hospitality and helped in every way get this show up and set up. I'm really grateful for their generosity in doing this. It's a wonderful venue. I like the idea of the intersection of science and art. And as Mark mentioned, the first people who went out to the parks were scientists and artists, the pictures and the paintings, to help people understand how magnificent this country was, this landscape is. And now it's a slightly different kind of role, because I think we value it in a certain way, but these national parks now have become islands or protected areas in a place where it used to be huge and vast and seemed like it was endless. Now it seems like these things are very important spaces to be in. I also want to thank a couple people for their support of this project. And first, my mother, Jane Martin, is here. Many of you may know her, who I have a story to tell about when I was a child, 14 years old, in the summer of '69, our family took one of those cross-country trips to see all the national parks from Albany, New York. Went to Yellowstone, Tetons, Grand Canyon. And at the Grand Canyon, we were staying at these cabins, and my mother planned to get up and go out and see the sunrise, and told my father and my sister and I that, and we all were invited. But when it came time to wake up in the morning, the three of us decided we'd stay in the cabin, and she went to the sunrise. And when she came back, she described that, but ever since then, I had a feeling like I'd missed something significant by not making that effort, even though I was a 14-year-old and sleep was important. I think in a way, in a measure, this is making up for that. Getting up early, sunrises, sunsets, making the effort to be out there and be present and feel the presence of this amazing earth we live on. The second is my wife, Jane, who's sacrificed the last 5 years of our life pretty much to this project. We came up with the idea together, which I'll hopefully can explain in some sense, but our life has been structured by it. All of the travel and logistics, budget, everything has been focused on making this happen, and I couldn't have done it without it. So, I've had this up on the board up here for, hopefully while you were sitting, you were able to read what Wallace Stegner said back in 1955. I think he was working to save the Dinosaur National Monument when he wrote this. But I love the whole thing, the whole idea, and just to give you an idea, sort of a convergence of ideas. I had no idea Ken Burns was going to do his PBS special when I decided to do this. I didn't even know it was going to be the 100th anniversary. So this was not intentional. It was the confluence of many ideas. But I love the idea that it is an idea, this idea of wilderness, of the space that we need to move into to have there for us to each have our own specific experience and relationship to this amazing earth we live on. Actually, the quote, maybe all of it, I can't remember, is right on a plaque as you're looking down into Kings Canyon, if anybody's been there, and that's where I first read it. And I'll show you an image of me painting there because it was very true. I could only go to the edge of Kings Canyon and look into it because it was New Year's Day and the road was closed. But it was symbolic at the same time. It kind of was very literally true that I was looking into this magnificent space. Just recently, a more recent writer, Terry Tempest Williams, who actually I think has been heavily influenced by Stegner, just came out with a book called The Hour of Land. She visited 12 national parks and writes about her experience. And her concern is the same as Stegner's in that it's about protecting these places and making sure we do, but there's a little bit more urgency about it. And I just love this idea of them being breathing spaces. And for me, Acadia has been one of those breathing spaces, so it's kind of wonderful to sort of kick off this project and sharing it with everybody because of that. But also this idea of breathing in and breathing out. This theme sort of flows through my work and through the reason I paint. The idea of the idea of this project really is based on a simple thing, and that is going to each of the national parks, being in those parks or present in them, and painting in them, rather than taking photographs and coming back to the studio, but actually having that experience of being present, standing there for half an hour to 3 hours, however long, and embracing that place, participating in it, engaging in it, and watching all those things that happen while you're standing there. The birds, the eagle, golden eagle that flies by, the light changes, it shifts, the rainbow comes, the Winnebagos go by, all sorts of things happen while you're out there. So it is a place where you're experiencing that, and the idea then is to take that, and those little paintings out there represent the being there, to take that, breathe it in, and then the larger paintings are the expression of that, or breathing back out. I've breathed a lot of the parks in. Now it's an experience of trying to process that and expand upon that for many more than 59 months, I'm sure. Also, the reason for the title of this show, which is sort of the series of shows, is that I do feel like I've been brought into a large place, and the reason I have thought about that has to do specifically with a teacher I studied with. His name is Neil Welliver, and I felt like and I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he lived over in Lincolnville. He bought 1,000 acres, and he pretty much painted his own land for the many decades of his life. And he was brought into a large place where he could not just literally, but could dwell in and work from. And I feel like in that sense, I've been brought into this kind of large place with many concepts and ideas to work from. Much rich material. And this is another thought that I wanted to share with you. I think it's interesting to contemplate, and I'm still seeing how it unfolds in my thought as to what this means. But Barry Lopez has written Open Ground and some other books on conservation issues and things, is the one who quoted this. But I think it's interesting to think of this landscape that we live in. We don't always pay attention to it. We live in it. We breathe in it. We're conscious of it. It is a part of our consciousness, and our consciousness, I think, is imprinted on it. And we are in some way a part of it. We are all part of a whole thing. We're not separate from the landscape. And so it does, in that sense, contain all cultures. Okay, let's look at some images. This is George Catlin, 1830s, one of the first people to voice the idea of making the nation's park. And he said, we need this place where the buffalo and the people who hunt them can still live freely. And he was one of the first people to go out with Meriwether Clark or whatever, I can't remember if it was him, on an expedition and began to paint the Indians themselves, but also the landscape. And these are, sort of background, contextual images, ideas that you need to know this project exists within. Of course, Thomas Moran is more famous in a way for bringing back these glorious images of the magnificence of the West, encouraging people to move farther westward to develop it further. And then the Hudson River School painters like George Church, Frederick Church. This is called Twilight in the Wilderness. And in a sense, it does represent this idea that the wilderness is, even though it's been vast and seemingly endless, it was starting to get used up, starting to be timbered and logged and mined. It was starting to disappear somewhat, this whole idea. But the importance of wilderness in shaping our consciousness as Americans is not to be is significant. But for me, the painters that I relate to, and I'm hoping to give you some sense of where I come from as a painter so you can understand the project from that, had to do mostly with people who painted in Maine and were more modern and more contemporary. Rockwell Kent, George Bellows, and the significance of this too is that they began to paint the landscape being there in the landscape, not from images or from concoctions of sketches, but these are direct, immediate things. John Marin's well known for painting the forces, bringing out things that are maybe invisible and making them visible to us. And also they begin, in Marsden Hartley, they begin to show the power of paint to express and embody these feelings and ideas and qualities that we see or experience in the landscape. I was just talking to somebody out there who we were talking about the difference between a picture of something, trying to paint something as a picture, and actually painting what it feels like to be there, to show the movement of the water, to show the way the light kind of filters through in this substance called paint. George O'Keeffe, of course, and that represents my movement west when I was just out of college, and then subsequently I moved out there, and I've been living off and on out there for at least 20 years. One of the Taos School, the power of the sky and the mountains. Also, an influence for me has been a partner in the American continent's sense of identity, or the Canadian Seven. This is Lauren Harris. Some of you may have seen his show that Steve Martin, the comedian, put together, curated at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. I think it's in Toronto now. They put together, this group of 7 painters, a sense of Canadian identity, or the sense of the North, beyond being this sort of repetition of European style of painting. Tom Thompson is probably one of the more significant influences on me, and he painted these paintings that were small in scale, from his canoe often on these lakes. Powerful, expressive, strong color, really direct and immediate brushstrokes. I was introduced to Tom Thompson by Neil Welliver, and also the idea of painting in the landscape and then taking these smaller paintings and making them large. And so Neil would go out and stand in the woods at all times of the year, paint these little 24 by 24 canvases or whatever he chose, and go day after day repeating it. And then he'd enlarge them or translate them into something much more magnificent in his studio. This is probably 8 feet by 6 feet wide. It's a magnificent painting. And a lot of his very complicated, very intricate in terms of color relationships. But I've also been influenced by older painters. Titian, a painter's painter in the Renaissance, magnificent way of using paint, and paint that began to, sort of become more ethereal and carry a sense of emotion, not just description. And I began to I've begun to take things like the whites in his robe or the blue over black in the sky and put them in some paintings of my own. And I'll show you some of those later. Constable, his ability to give you a sense of the wetness and dewiness, the sparkle of the landscape. And I particularly like his sketches, these big oil sketches he did, they were called, more than his finished pieces. Turner as well. And the whole idea of landscape is a pretty recent one. People didn't start painting the landscape as the landscape until the 1800s. Before, it used to be these little slivers of background that everything else took place in. And I think that it just emerged as a subject that it could actually hold its own without having to have even a person in it. Cézanne certainly lived that and would repeatedly go to the same motif or same place and work over and over again and get something out of it each day and begin to organize this beautiful sense of syncopation and order that is so amazing and satisfying, and has influenced everybody else since he painted those. Bonnard is another favorite. His use of color, the lusciousness of it, the sense of being able to get a sense of light in color alone without being descriptive, the glow of the color, plus the way he marked the surface was so sort of human and not with a lot of bravura, but just so felt. I also grew up in the time of the abstract expressionists, and they definitely influenced me in terms of the gesture of paint, the reducing to certain essences of elements. And they even have sort of, the ones I like the most have landscape elements in them. This is de Kooning, and I love the way he moved the paint, but it was also based on his walks by the water in Long Island, seeing the reflections of color on the water. Hans Hofmann definitely influenced me in terms of color. Joan Mitchell's a huge influence. She's an abstract expressionist who lived near where Monet lived in France, and her whole idea of working from what she saw and felt and then somehow generating these canvases that are landscape-like and atmospheric at the same time. They're beautiful commotions of color. A current painter named John Walker lives down in Georgetown, Maine, has been painting the same point for over 20 years. And an incredible kind of invention and repetition, invention against a kind of repetitive subject, because the same island is in there, the same mud flats or whatever, but they're so inventive and so beautiful. And the thing that I particularly relate to of his is that he found all these bingo cards in his studio, or the building he uses as a studio, and they're 5 by 7. He's painted hundreds and hundreds of these. Never the same, never repeating the same composition. So fresh, kind of pointing to the infinity of possibility. And again, the idea of small paintings, large paintings. Some of his paintings are, as big as this light space on the wall, and his little paintings are so full and so intense. And that's why I started on, this is another painter from Britain, Frank Auerbach, who I quote later, whose use of paint gives you a sense of the feeling of that artist. There's a carrier of the emotion is the way the paint is moved, not so much the description. And I just want to step aside and say, next time you're in a museum and you're looking at a Rembrandt or a Van Gogh, realize you're having a direct conversation with that painter. you can look at those brushstrokes. That person stood in front of that canvas and made that paint move. And there's no separation between you and that paint, and that there is something that is said in that very act of that tangible substance being moved around, pushed around on a canvas. And I love that whole idea that there's something embedded in that, what one critic called the psychic surface. But it has the surface of paintings are as important, and the way the paint is moved as a carrier of feeling and emotion as the image itself, the story itself. And here's another current painter named Eric Aho, who paints more from memory than from life. So he's very capable. But you can see tree trunks, but then you're looking through the tree trunks. It's more about the experience of being there and how it is, translated into a painting that gives multiple views of the same experience. John Marin said this wonderful thing. To paint the landscape, you must bow to it first, and then you have to wait, and if it bows to you, then you're able to go ahead and paint it. And it's not literally, but in the sense that you need to acknowledge that landscape and begin to let it talk to you and honor it. And I feel like that's what this project does for me, is that I've been trying to honor what this magnificent, beautiful earth we live on and translate that into paint. So my work, this just gives you a little background as to the progress to getting to the project. And we will get there. We'll talk more about these paintings in a minute. Calhoun County, a little wedge of river between the Illinois and the Mississippi River near where I went to college and where I teach. Beautiful rolling farm fields. And I found right after college, 2 years out of college, that I could actually use that as a subject that had more meaning to me than other forms. And so I did a whole series of work and had my very first exhibition after college of a whole series of washes on paper or watercolor on paper, done on location, not in the studio, of that. And I went on to graduate school about 5 or 6 years later and studied with Neil Welliver. And as anybody who's ever been to graduate school knows, in painting or in art, it is a scrutinizing time. You're looking hard at yourself, and you get you go through a kind of purifying process, and you're looking hard at things, and you come out in a good way afterwards. But this sort of represents that, but it also represents very specific formal choices and choices about painting that I began to realize was the first real painting I think I did in my career. That was, it generated quite a bit of excitement among my colleagues too at that point. I think this painting and the series that came after it, there was something was happening here, some decisions that were being made and something embodied in it that has continued to teach me after that. Here is something familiar to a lot of you. This is Deer Isle, and this is after graduate school. I began painting again in Maine, painting gouaches on location. You can see a little bit of the Welliver influence in there. I traveled to Scotland, spent about 8 years in Scotland. Took some students over there, and we traveled and painted there. And I would do these are sheets like this, put them together and paint them on location. This was particularly influenced by Joan Mitchell, the abstract expressionist, painting the river, the idea of flow and things moving, and then trying to get some kind of sense of solidity and order to the whole idea. This statement really, I think, is key to what I try to do, is to look beyond what I see and to see more, to try to express in my painting more than I'm seeing in the outward sense of things, not just the surface of things. And so I put that in there at a time when I think my painting began to do more of that. This is also, a lot of these paintings are on Deer Isle. Had to do with Deer Isle, but they're less about that and more about light and reflection, that kind of thing. I moved to the west and became engaged with the whole, the beauty of the Western light. And this was in New Mexico, also in Tucson, Arizona. My painting became richer, more fully expressed. The West really opened things up for me. I also became so enamored with the sky out there and began painting it, which was this idea of trying to paint something that doesn't sit still, something that's flowing, something that's moving constantly. And it opened up a whole new way of moving paint around. And I began to do my own large paintings, like some of these other painters I had admired. This is 5 feet by 4 feet, clouds over the landscape. Anybody see the connection with Titian here, going back to the white robe and the blue over black sky? I began taking some of those different things I saw in paintings I admired and translating them into the landscapes I was doing. This is 4 by 4, 7 feet by 6 feet. That's from memory. It's not from any particular smaller painting I did. Huge thunderhead, clear at the top, and Virga coming down at the bottom, rain not touching the ground over a mesa in northern Arizona. Along the Chama River, another 6 by 7, an homage to Bonnard, called Bonnard's Palo Verde. The Palo Verdes turn this gorgeous yellow in the springtime in Arizona. I painted the ocean, painted glaciers in Patagonia, back to Maine, even our backyard. So this brings us to the project, really. The clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness, and the idea began to emerge that maybe because I was loving painting in these national parks near us in Arizona and other places, that maybe I could make that the focus of my work. And I don't even know how we came up with this idea, but my wife and I sort of batted it around, and it merged into this idea that maybe I could try to do all the parks in a certain period of time, and 58 and 58 was born. This road represents that idea into it. It's going off towards the Great Sand Dunes in New Mexico, which our Colorado home or studio building is near. Prefacing that is that when we were living in Crested Butte for about 4 years, we had no studio and just a place to set my paints down, a little box and like that. So I just grabbed a bunch of little postcard-sized panels and began going out every day and painting directly from nature these little tiny posts. This is 6 inches by 4 inches. And I began to realize that small could be as substantial as something large and dramatic and complicated. And so I began to put everything into that, and what emerged was this amazing series, which I felt was like sort of appearing to me. I was witnessing it happening, of paintings of the winter light, another 4 inches by 6 inches. Same thing, vertical. And they just, it taught me something, and it became, this is the Mississippi River from where I teach. But it taught me something that, and I think Auerbach puts it that way, a good painting concentrates the experience of being. And the whole idea of going in the parks and painting and being in the parks is to have that experience and have it somehow get concentrated and focused in those paintings. So, finally, we're getting to the parks. Very first park, the Needles area in Canyonlands, March 2011. My wife and I had been car camping with friends. We got up before dawn, and I had to take my wife with me because she was asleep in the back, and we drove out to this spot, and she did wake up and take a photo of me painting to record that moment. But it was the beginning of that, and this gives you an idea of what it looked like. I went from this little thing to this large 4 by 5. And that was largely informed by my memory, not so much by photos. So I use photos as reference. I try not to paint the photo because you end up painting the photograph, not the thing itself, but try to paint more from what I was experiencing there, what I saw and felt. And you are able to expand on that or enlarge that in your painting. Great Basin National Park. Anybody ever been there? It's good. It's amazing park out in the middle of Nevada. You have to drive forever to get there. This is Wheeler Peak, what's left of a glacier up in there. Bristlecone pines all around you, 2,000, 3,000 years old. And I painted this. This is the painting out in the lobby. This was the little one I painted there, going back. And then this is the big one that's out there in the lobby, whatever, the gallery. Again, an example, this is in Canyonlands 2, a gray, smoky kind of day. It became this painting. I was able to somehow absorb the sense of what the color was like there, even though it was the more muted kind of day, and expand on it, develop it, and I had a wonderful time with all the color in between these cliffs, developing a sense of that idea. Painting on New Year's Day in Sequoia, just to give you an idea how big the painting was and how big the tree is. And the idea of how to actually express the massiveness of these trees without trying to paint a big toothpick was, maybe it's the massiveness of that trunk, that bowl of the tree that I love so much. And so I think it begins to take on that monumentality. And this painting is out in the lobby as well. I didn't actually paint this little painting on location. I was there, watched this whole thing happen, sketched, took photos. But I did paint that in the studio, and then I painted, this is 80 inches tall by 30 inches wide. Trying to take that classic iconic thing. Most of the time I chose not to paint the icons. And somebody was mentioning, how did I choose what to paint? At first I thought maybe I was going to have to paint like the iconic image, what's Acadia, what's Yosemite, what's Bryce. But I began to really open myself up to what the experience was when I got there. And this is Yellowstone too. This is North Yellowstone, a moment that happened of light when this kind of diamond shape of gold showed up in these clouds up there, these wonderful clouds. And I did took some photos, made some notes and sketches, and then developed this back in the studio. This is 5 feet by 6 feet. And I think back in the studio, you begin to develop that even further, this idea that you're alone with that paint and that canvas, and you're moving it around, and something kind of musical starts to happen with these relationships. It's not about trying to draw the shape and then color it in. It's about these relationships between color and texture and movement and brushstroke, and it starts to take on a meaning. This is also out in the lobby here, out in the gallery. The interesting thing about this is that my wife and I were there in Zion with a multitude of people. And if you've ever been there in the summer, you have to take the bus in. And we walked up through the Narrows, up the Virgin River. There were a lot of people around us, and at first I was like super grumpy that we had to be there with all those people. It was very selfish. But I began to really enjoy it, and after we kind of helped one family move across the water that weren't going to go any farther unless we helped them, and I began to enjoy it. And it was a very European crowd, but you kind of forgot them because the landscape was so magnificent, so monumental and extraordinary, and we were all enthralled by it. But I did include them in this painting. So when I painted the large painting, I wanted there to be a feeling of the presence of some of those people without literally illustrating them. So this purple shadow is actually a young man with a bright purple magenta shirt on, and another one down there climbing the rocks. There's a guy in the water up in here. There's a little shadow of a vertical figure there, and I kind of let them be there as presences because it was part of my experience, and it turned into a really lovely experience. I don't often do that kind of thing, but I thought that was really important to share that. And then the idea of being in the parks and being with people also experiencing the parks began to emerge as something that was worthwhile and interesting, and to enjoy it together rather than always seeking the ultimate wilderness alone experience. This is another example of that. This is in Colorado. This is up on Trail Ridge Road. It's up in the tundra. It was in July, magnificent summer. I would get up at 4, get to get up there by 9 before everybody started arriving. And pretty soon, by the middle of the day, it's Winnebagos and Harley Davidsons with music blaring and that kind of stuff. But I found a little crevice in the rocks off the road, just far enough away from that, and set up my easel and painted. And then this is a painting I did in the studio. This is 6 feet by 7 feet of that particular place. And then I did a whole little series of smaller paintings from that spot. Sometimes things just happened where we were. This is right where we were camped out, and that was the sunset, I think, against the orange cliffs at Capitol Reef. And the little paintings out there, this is the large one, it's 5 feet by 4 feet. Also a Capitol Reef. And also you begin to see where the painting takes on new elements in terms of color. Somebody was mentioning they're appreciating that. There are layers and layers of color being developed in the larger work in the studio that you can't do when you're painting alla prima or directly in the landscape. John Muir said so many wonderful things about being in the landscape, but I particularly relate to this one, and I think standing on the ledges out here at Schoodic, sometimes it feels like that too, this movement of the water, and it just feels like it's not just separate from you, it's also something that you are feeling, you are part of that movement. So this is in the painting that came from this experience is out there in the gallery too. This is me way up the little speck up there at the top. This is taken by a person I didn't know until about 15, 20 minutes later. And this is an area called Staircase in Olympic National Park. Just an amazing series of waterfalls and the water roaring around you. I couldn't hear anything, and I was out on this rock painting this little painting and getting really frustrated that I wasn't getting the right color. And I had my brushes in my hand, and Duncan, just get it right. And I went like this, and it turned out there was this woman standing right next to me, trying to talk to me. It was so loud, and she had taken these photographs, posted them on Facebook. But fortunately, I didn't swear. But I was getting it enough, because then it became this painting, which I have to say is one of my favorite paintings of the whole series that's out here. And this is many layers of underpainting and color, and just barely, in some cases, just barely a brushstroke dragged over the surface. And somehow that got the sense of movement, the sense of sparkle in the water. And somewhere in there, I feel like you can also hear the water. There also had some experiences which I thought would be interesting to share of where, not just the landscape, but what was going on in the landscape, those creatures that live there with us. And we were all part of this one same body or experience. This is Teddy Roosevelt National Park. Teddy was so important to the establishment of the national parks. This is the Little Missouri River. This is an experience of getting up early in the morning. Looked misty, didn't look that great. Got there, the mist began to burn away. Just beautiful. And as I was painting, I heard behind me the whole herd of buffalo coming out of the woods with little young buffalo, and they're all kind of snorting, making these, I won't do the noises for you, but they were doing it was wonderful. And I was grateful they were on the other side of the river. But it was, I felt like we were all sort of waking up to this day together. I did this little painting from that spot, and I haven't done a large one of this particular thing yet. Also, there is still some true wilderness, I think, in the national park system. This is Gates of the Arctic. It's above the Arctic Circle. I spent 3 weeks last summer going to Alaska to get to the 8 national parks, and I spent most of my time on little planes or on boats trying to get there, more than I spent in the parks in some cases. But this is flying into the gates, the two mountains that are the Gates of the Arctic are named for. I had to fly into a town called Bettles. After 3 flights, I got to Bettles, stayed there until the weather cleared, and hired this bush pilot to fly me into the gates. Bettles was also the place where if you're going into the Gates of the Arctic to float down the river or stay on a lake or hike through some of the peaks areas, that's where you outfit and get taken in. You can't drive there, you can't walk there. I mean, you can walk there, but it's a long walk. So you really have to fly. It's a really long walk. Bob Marshall, who's really well known for his development of the Wilderness Society and whatever, he actually mapped this area, and his sort of spirit is infused in this landscape, and he named the Gates of the Arctic. So this little plane, we're going to land out there on that gravel, and I spent a couple glorious hours right below these peaks, and it's probably the closest I came to really feeling the wildness of the wilderness, of being alone, except for I was with him, but we were miles from anywhere, from any people. It was really, really an amazing experience. And I spent the afternoon painting there, and had this little painting is out there. That was a wonderful experience. My son joined me for part of my trip to Alaska, and we could drive to Wrangell St. Elias, which is the largest park in the park system. It's massive. It's several times the size of Yellowstone. It has amazing glaciers and things, and we walked into the Root Glacier. We rented some crampons and teeter-tottered across the top of the glacier and set up. I did a couple paintings there. I was quite inspired by it. We passed a black bear on the way in there, who gave us no mind because he was pretty interested in the berries he was eating. And this is one of the paintings. In Alaska also, the other way to get places would take a boat. This is Glacier Bay. It's one of the more popular places to go. You get on the National Park boat, you spend the whole day going in. And it was pretty cloudy starting, and it broke open to full sunshine. And this is at Johns Hopkins. I had about 45 minutes to paint this little painting. Grace of the skipper, he knew what I was doing, and he said he'd give me a little more time. So I was on the back of the boat and was able to work my way through this painting in about 45 minutes. And there it is. It will become a large painting eventually. On the way in there, I also passed a thing called the Huna Glacier. Just caught my eye, and I grabbed a little piece of canvas or whatever and made a few notes, and then I developed this from memory back in the studio. And I love the little study because of what it represents, but I feel like this kind of gets more of the magnificent, the sense of the area, the glacier light, and it kind of represents something in the reflections, the hint of a iceberg in the foreground. It kind of, in paint, represents more of what it was like to be there. Another experience is on the Channel Islands. Anybody been to the Channel Islands off of Santa Barbara? Yeah, and it's there's several islands, and my son and I went out and we stayed on Anacapa. What we didn't know was the nesting time for gulls, and we were the only people who chose to go camping on that island at that point, except for the rangers who were there. So it was a magnificent time. It was almost primeval feeling. This is at the end of Anacapa. This is the other guy who's on the island with us, who was there to count not seagulls, but songbirds, of all things, walking out in the morning, and the gulls were rising up all around him. It was pretty noisy, but it was a beautiful morning, and it's one of the few times they put an animal, and there's a little gull note down here in the corner. There's another painting of the end of Anacapa. I also had some experiences where I wasn't really smart about what I was doing. And this is at Carlsbad Caverns. I didn't know, I thought you could just walk in and I would just go down and paint a little watercolor or something. And turns out you have to get permission. I would have taken several weeks or months to apply and set up this whole thing. So I had to settle for painting the entrance to Carlsbad. Someday I'll go back there. But I did have a good experience with this park ranger, who took me on a 2-hour tour, personal tour. No one else came with us. She took me for a private tour for 2 hours through Mammoth Cave because I did get my act together and let her know I was coming. And she set it up for me to paint in the entrance to Mammoth Cave. This is looking down in it and looking back out. Wonderful experience. A little different painting-wise because I was looking at the light, and then I looked back at the paint, and it got dark, and my eyes were going back and forth, and I was surprised that it actually worked out because the adjustments were awkward, but it has a kind of strange color, but it actually represented more like there's a certain cave-like experience or cave-like light that you get, and it has that waterfall coming down in the middle of it. Love painting water, the movement of water. This is in Shannon. No. Great Smoky. Also, places like Rainier were magnificent. but often very crowded. And this was an extraordinary discovery. We found this, Jane and I found this moraine trail that no one was on. The other parts of it were like a freeway with people with baby strollers and things like that going up farther up the mountain. But we were able to go in here, and the riotous wildflowers, just gorgeous, right to the edge of the glacier. And that has yielded some work and will continue to yield some magnificent work, I'm sure. This is from another part of the park called Sunrise. Gives a sense of the monumental quality of the mountain. Kings Canyon, looking into it, January 1st, pretty cold, and a professional photographer came along and took a photograph of me while I was painting it, so we exchanged that. It was nice. But the light went fast, and it came out pretty well for about a half an hour painting. That's the road down into Kings Canyon. And that's the part Stegner talked about. Being able to even look into it was important. I also had a wonderful experience. My son was with me again, and we flew up and landed on a glacier up on Denali. And we flew around, but we landed on a glacier, and we're out there for a half an hour, and I painted a quick little watercolor from that spot. But it was an amazing experience. And there are sand dunes in Alaska. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but there's this park above the Arctic Circle called Kobuk Valley. We flew over the sand dunes because I couldn't arrange. It's so expensive to hire a flight, and to fly in or take a boat in was beyond my budget at that point. But I did hire a native guy from Ambler, this town that I stayed in, and Luke took me in. He'd grown up there. He took me in on his boat. We left at 7 p.m. and came back at midnight. It was light the whole time, and he told me all sorts of stories where we saw a wolverine running along the shore, showed me where he'd shot some wolves, where his grandmother was buried. They dug wild onions and rhubarb, and it was very rich and a wonderful experience. And he anchored the boat just where the caribou cross at Onion Portage, and I painted a little painting, which looks a lot more like Maine than I had realized, but it was kind of a still water thing. Denali was a wonderful experience too. Dry Tortugas is another favorite and amazing experience. 2-hour boat trip out across this amazing aqua water, and there's an old Civil War fort there, but the water and the beach are quite magnificent. And this is a little pocket beach away from the maddening crowds on Trunk Bay on St. John in the Virgin Islands. And I was able to, I think, have some good painting experiences trying to paint the aqua color, and that painting is out here too. And another surprise was Congaree. I don't know if you know of this national park, but it's in South Carolina. It's one of the largest old-growth forests in the southeast, or maybe the largest. It's loblolly pine and bald cypress and that kind of thing. But I found that it was actually pretty dang interesting to try to paint it with the prismatic colors and things, and I think it will yield some interesting paintings. So I painted the cypress sitting in the water. One of my most favorite experiences was going up Haleakala in the afternoon and arriving up here and seeing this view of what they call the crater, but is the valley filled with a lot of different craters on the top of this volcano. You start at Maui, you start at sea level and go up to 10,000 feet in about 38 miles, and all of a sudden you're up at the top of this. It was overwhelmingly beautiful. And I haven't completely learned how to paint it, but I was happy painting it that evening. Did a little study, and then was treated with a lot of other people to this shadow of Haleakala looking off of it. And this is American Samoa. I wanted to include this because many of you probably can't believe there even is a park out in American Samoa. It's below the equator. This is what it was like the morning I woke up. You have to fly out there from Hawaii. It's 5 hours flight from Hawaii. There's 2 flights a week. And it's the most un-national park-like park that I've been to. The visitor center is a little place in town, and then It was closed the whole weekend I was there. I didn't see a park ranger. I saw a few signs that say that it's a national park. I didn't see another park visitor or another American looking at the park. But I ended up painting this beautiful place called Pola Island in Vaiavata Strait, and ended up down, well, this is me painting that spot, and then ended up going down where the surf crashes and painting the next day through a tunnel, through the jungle. I had to go through this village. And on the way back out, I found out that the Sa and Samoa means sacred, and it's a sacred place. And every night in these traditional villages, from 5 to 6, they spend an hour in prayer. So if you come back through, you have to stop. They don't want you to drive through, so you stop. And I stopped with them and sat on the rocks with a couple of young men, and it was quiet for an hour, and we meditated and prayed or whatever. And then they blew a conch shell, and that was kind of a nice way to interact with those folks. But I did paint here, and the surf was just astounding in this spot. This painting's out on the wall too. And another probably profound experience was painting the glow of the volcano at the Hawaii volcanoes. This is at dawn. I got up, instead of doing it at night when it was more crowded, I got up and was going back to the Grand Canyon experience. Was one of the only 4 people, a family of 4 was up watching it. And it had this most amazing, ethereal, unearthly kind of glow to it. I did go down through the lava fields to where the lava meets the ocean, and found it fascinating and almost hard to figure out what to paint. So I finally just sat down and painted this kind of place where the lava had ended, frozen in a spot, and painted this little painting, trying to understand all the color that's in black in lava. That same day, I got on a plane and flew out to Glacier so that I could actually finish the project in 59 months exactly. And I arrived in the rain in Glacier and took the car up there, and right when I got there, the sun broke through, and I painted this evening the final painting of the National Park series at Glacier. And I'm definitely going back because I really didn't see enough of that. This is the most recent painting. It's just outside in the entryway here of the cliffs of Idaho, and I had to include it because it's Acadia. It's probably the most visited part of Acadia I've been to from our family's house in Stonington. I've gone out there quite a bit, but I feel like probably maybe one of the best paintings so far of the project. It gets the feeling of what it's like to come out on the top of those rocks, and with the surf moving, the sparkle, the sound of the water there. If you want to find out more about the project, this is where you can go to take a look at it. It's on my website, and I will continue to edify that. So I hope I haven't taken you too long through this, and if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
To benefit others so that they can hear you, if you have a question, I'd like to run this mic to you, and if you do, put it close to your lips. It works better that way.
Duncan, this is spectacular. Could you put up one slide of a painting and tell us a little bit about composition and some of the decisions
Sure.
you might make in
Okay.
how you frame your work?
Let's see. Well, let's talk about this one. Okay? Or is there one you had in mind? Okay. Part of that experience is, and if you walk out the forest trail, it's quiet, and then you come up on this ledge and you look down over this very fractured rock. It's not like the rock on Otter Cliffs where it's kind of squarish. It's fractured in a very chaotic sort of way, and it seems like it repeats itself all the way across. So somehow I wanted to give a sense of that feeling. Also the feeling of being above and looking down. There's a lot of different perspectives within this one painting. So you're looking down at the water at one point, and you're looking across to the cliffs there, and then there's that more sort of traditional distance there. So I'm not sure it would work out in a photograph to do this. It was trying to get all those things in one particular composition. So the high horizon's really important. The sky was not important. It needed a little bit of that. And I also wanted to give a sense of the expanse of the water, that you were above it, and the water changed from rough, and then the sparkles on the water. So I wanted that. But I particularly like, personally, the foreground and then this one flat section of rock right here with the seaweed and the barnacles and everything, this whole brownish thing here. And that dark shadow on the first vertical part right up in about 2/3 of the way up. That was really important, getting that and then getting the white light that bounces off of these. And so every time I mixed the white differently, but it was sort of basically had this blue, a kind of blue in it, and had some purplish, pinkish thing and a little bit of yellow. So it kind of went back and forth. And it gradually, if I were to take the color and the distance off of those rocks and put it in the front, it would look, against the warmer color, it would look very blue. But the ones in the front are more pink or yellow. So there was a constant adjustment or orchestration of those colors. I also felt that I wanted to have a little bit more of the sense of gesture in the foreground, but to keep it kind of going to the back, but to have this sense of, when you're standing somewhere and looking out over it, you don't look at the ground and then look at everything else at the same time, and the ground gets kind of passed over. So in a way, the gesture just is that superstructure you're standing on, and then you get more detailed and more specific in certain spots. I don't know, is there anything else? Any questions about this?
Is that an acrylic or oil that you're working with?
This is oil, and all of my paintings are oil paintings. I did some watercolors during the project, but most of the work I did was oil on location using this little kit or in the studio. Anything else?
Duncan, you're talking about that kit or that box. Could you talk a little bit about how you thought about what colors and how you do the palette and when you're going in different places? Because the colors are different. How did you think about that?
Okay. What's interesting about that is I use the same palette of colors everywhere. But it has to do with how you use those colors. So I have the same palette. I definitely had, when I went to the South Pacific or the Virgin Islands, I made sure I had this aqua color. And I probably use more of that. But here I use more of there's a little bit of that in there, but it's more cerulean and ultramarine. So I had, pretty much the same palette, all that I've worked with for years. And that is really more how you use it and what you place it next to in proportion to something else, how it works. This idea is not my idea. This is a box you can buy these days, which has been a wonderful invention. And it packs up all into this, so I could easily travel to American Samoa or up into Alaska because I was confined. But it has a place for panels to slip in and out. And then I also have a friend up in Seattle who's a woodworker, and he made these boxes for me to carry wet paintings. So I kind of worked it out to be a very simplified, economical thing, but everything I need is either in there or in this bag. But it's an interesting question because I think you assume, well, I'm going to Hawaii, I better buy Hawaiian colors, or I'm going to Alaska. But it's all the same, they were all the same palette. Yeah.
Hello, Duncan. Great presentation. How did you maintain the integrity of the paint during extreme temperature conditions?
How did I keep the integrity of the paint when the temperature was really high or really, really cold? I find that it doesn't get, when it's really cold, I have been able to use oil paint. It's a little gummy, sort of, but it actually works for me. I don't know. And then with heat, that hasn't really ever been a problem. But somehow I painted in the winter in Deer Isle, and I painted. I haven't recently painted, but somehow, have you had that problem? Is that an issue?
I'm not a painter.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Because it sounded like you knew what you were talking about. Yeah. It actually, it's just a little stiffer, but I often, when we lived in Crested Butte, I would keep the paint inside and then take it out, and it was more fluid then. But it's more of a mixture of the mediums into it that actually makes it flow a little better during the winter. Yeah.
How did you budget? And did you make budget? And
You need to answer that question.
have a grant?
No.
And will you sell the paintings?
Yes,
And
okay.
What's the outcome of all of this?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of questions in that question. Number one, when I started the project, I didn't know I was going to be teaching full-time. So then all of a sudden doing it in 5 years meant I was doing it on breaks. And had to be carefully orchestrated. I didn't accept any sponsorship from the National Park or the National Park Foundation or any other groups or whatever. I thought about that for a while, but then decided I wanted complete editorial freedom. I did get a wonderful grant from Principia College when I went on sabbatical. They have a research grant that made it possible to go to Alaska, because by far that was the most expensive, almost more expensive than everything else to get around to those parks. So I did that. I have been fortunate to sell, as a lot of those large paintings have been sold. I've been selling the small ones. The stipulation with that is that hopefully most people will let me use them if I want to have a comprehensive exhibition, and most people have signed on with that. The idea is to put together a book or books that will represent this whole experience in some way or another. And I'm working on how that's going to come together, because obviously there are a lot of stories. My website will certainly reflect that. I hope that there's going to be a traveling exhibition of some sort. This is the beginning, and we'll see where that goes. This is not a comprehensive one, but somehow we're going to work to put that together. That?
The percentage of paintings.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's really important. I am donating, for this show, I'm donating 5% of all my painting sales to Schoodic Institute. But for the rest of the project, I'm donating 5% to the National Parks Foundation, which is the what do you call it? Fundraising arm of, the official fundraising arm of the National Park Service. So yes. It's the least I can do to say I'm grateful. So I'm open to what other things, but I know for sure a book, an exhibition, and we'll see what goes from there. And yes, they're for sale. There's information as to who to contact to buy them. Not me directly. It's being done through a third party for this show.
That might be a nice natural break, but
It-
again, could we all thank Duncan?
Thank you. Thank you.
And again, thank you all for coming. And that was by far the richest experience we've ever had with an artist reception. Usually we get relatively brief comments and rely just on the work. And that was a wonderful presentation. So thank you.